Welcome back to part 2 of 3 from this little, really I'd call it a mini-series of Napoleon in Russia by Epic History TV. Fantastic channel, just one of the best. I cannot talk about how much I love Epic History TV enough. But today we're going to be looking at Borodino, 1812, Napoleon's bloodiest day. Now, the Russians have retreated, and Alexander I is looking to his generals here and saying, we have to face the French in battle, and eventually this is going to be the day. The bloodiest day at this point in European history, I believe. It would be topped later. But nonetheless, let's take a look at this. Borodino, 1812 by Epic History TV. If you haven't already yet, go check out the other videos I've done on this, the other reaction videos I've done on this, because Epic History TV is just amazing. Go support their channel, become a patron. They're one of the best out there, by far. Let's get into it.
This Epic History TV video is brought to you by Magellan TV, the documentary streaming service.
Yep. By far. And that's interesting to say too, considering at Waterloo he lost his empire, right? For the final time after being exiled, of course. But that's interesting that for him to use the word terrible, I think he might mean terrible. Again, he wrote it in French, but hey, I think he might mean terrible in terms of loss of life and just the horrors and sights. But I find that that's interesting that he says that was really his most terrible one, was here at Borodino.
Russia, 1812. Napoleon invades his former ally with the largest army Europe has ever seen. But for the French Emperor, the decisive blow remains frustratingly beyond reach. Russia's resilience is unlike anything he's ever encountered. And as winter closes in, his army begins the most infamous retreat in history.
So good. Seriously, come on.
September 1812. 10 weeks had passed since Napoleon invaded Russia with more than 500,000 men. The French Emperor wanted a quick victory over the Russians, one that would force Emperor Alexander to make peace and agree to French terms. But at Vitebsk and then Smolensk, the outnumbered Russian army had narrowly escaped his clutches.
Yep.
The holy city of Smolensk had been virtually destroyed. Napoleon had advanced deep into Russia, and months of marching had left his army decimated by disease and exhaustion. It was now half its original strength, and summer was nearly over. But finally, 70 miles west of Moscow, near the village of Borodino, the Russians had turned to offer battle. Napoleon would have a chance to win.
And it wasn't just, as I said in the beginning too, right? This was really influencing Kutuzov, though favoring the strategy of his fellow general. They mentioned this in the last video, right? He thinks that it's important, even from a morale standpoint, to give battle to the French here, right? Can you imagine if the Russians, although it is the smart tactic of consistently retreating, right, and using a scorched earth technique, can you imagine if they had have taken Moscow basically for free, right? The morale and the propaganda here is also really important for the Russians.
The decisive victory that he believed would end the war. In 1812, Napoleon was master of Europe.
And Magellan TV, it's a good service. I know that Mark Felton has also worked with them before. Go check it out.
The Russian army, commanded by the 67-year-old, one-eyed veteran General Kutuzov, occupied a defensive position across the two main roads leading from Smolensk to Moscow.
Very creatively
General
named.
Barclay de Tolly's First Army was on the right, its front protected by the Kalatsha River, steep-banked but shallow and easily forded. Prince Bagration's Second Army was on the left, a more open position but reinforced by major earthworks, the Great Redoubt, and what the French nicknamed, for their shape, the Flèche, the arrows. Another forward redoubt at Borodino was expected to delay the enemy's advance. Historians still dispute the size of the Russian army, but it's likely Kutuzov had around 121,000 men and 680 guns at Borodino.
I mean, look at this fortified position too, right? This is stretching a couple kilometers at least, right? A couple of miles. I can only imagine what this would have actually looked like. That's the thing that's always a shame, is that we've been going through this series because, you know, the photograph wasn't really around yet. Napoleon would die, I think, a decade or so before photography would really be invented. It's just a shame that you can't really get to see this, you know, at least in photographic form. It's a shame.
On the 5th of September, Napoleon's army began to arrive from the west. Around 130,000 men and 585 guns. Napoleon quickly saw that the Borodino redoubt would have to be taken before he could deploy his army, and ordered an immediate assault. The attack was led by Compan's 5th Division of the 1st Corps, supported by the Polish 5th Corps to the south. In several hours of heavy fighting, the redoubt changed hands more than once. But late that evening, the Russians finally withdrew to their main line, and the redoubt fell to the French. Its capture had cost them an estimated 4,000 casualties, while the Russians lost around 6,000 men. Napoleon noted how few prisoners were taken, a worrying sign of the enemy's unbroken resolve.
I mean, they're right outside the historic, although it's not the capital of the country. Obviously, St. Petersburg is the capital, which though would be moved back in a few decades. But anyways, they're really just outside of the historic center of Moscow. And I think that the Russian troops at this point are really wanting that fight for the French. There's foreign invaders in their homeland. Oh, as I muted as well. Very nice.
Both sides spent the next day preparing for battle. Marshal Davout, commanding French 1st Corps and widely considered Napoleon's most able subordinate, appealed to the Emperor to use his corps to make a wide, outflanking attack to the south. But Napoleon dismissed the idea as too risky, and instead began preparing for a massive frontal assault on the Russian defenses.
Fascinating that a massive frontal assault is not considered risky, yet the maneuver here would be. Though, to be fair, as we've seen, what Napoleon would do would actually be to cut through, right, said swinging maneuver here. So, interesting. I mean, you have 200,000 men on a battlefield here.
Shortly after dawn on the 7th of September, Orthodox priests paraded one of Russia's holiest icons, Our Lady of Smolensk, before the Russian army.
Wow.
It was a stirring sight for many devout Russian soldiers, thousands of whom would not live to see dusk. The battle began at 6 a.m. as French batteries opened a deafening cannonade against the Russian defenses. Eugene's 4th Corps advanced on Borodino village, lightly held by Jaegers of the Russian Imperial Guard. After clearing the village, his infantry crossed the Kalacha and advanced towards the Great Redoubt, but were driven back with heavy losses. The Russians burned the bridge across the river, but did not launch a counterattack, and Eugene was able to move cannon into the village to put flanking fire on the Great Redoubt. In the centre, Davout's 1st Corps began its advance against the Flèche, coming under heavy fire. While on the right, the Polish 5th Corps, ordered to take Utitsa, got held up in the woods and ravines. Their slow advance allowed Tushkov's 3rd Corps to send a division north to reinforce the Fleche defences. Kutuzov, at his headquarters in Gorky, took little part in the battle, leaving tactical decisions to his subordinates.
Interesting.
Barclay and
If I remember correctly, this was one of the flaws that the other armies of Napoleon fought against, is that there wasn't that tactical maneuverability, right? I'm thinking about like during his first campaign in Italy there when fighting the Austrians, also a video series from Epic History TV, seriously, go check them out, that this tactical flexibility was always very centralized command and control, whereas here it appears actually more moderately decentralized, which would probably be a big advantage considering, I mean, look at the size of this, right? There's 250,000 men here fighting each other.
Bagration had spent
At point of this, and I was just thinking this in my head actually when I was watching this, is, man, what a waste of life, you know? Like, throughout this whole series, we've been talked about tens of thousands of casualties and 25,000 casualties and 100,000 casualties and everything like this. And you just go, God, like how many families here were really destroyed by all of this? And for what? You know? For what? For the will of one, almost the will of one man to be the king of Europe, you know? I don't know. That was just a thought that I had in my head that I hadn't had while watching this series. And I don't know. Let me know what you think in the comment section down below. Maybe it's a little bit too glorified, you know?
most of the summer arguing furiously over strategy, but in the hour of crisis, they put their differences aside.
Yep.
They could see the main French attack was falling on the Russian centre and left. So Barclay ordered General Bagavout's 2nd Corps south to reinforce Bagration. Fighting around the Fleche intensified as the French captured one of the earthworks, only to be driven out by a Russian counterattack. Davout himself was injured in the fighting as he fell from his dying horse, but he refused to leave the field.
Lucky he
When
didn't
Russian
die.
cavalry counterattacked, Marshal Murat himself led the French cavalry forward to meet them. Ney's 3rd Corps now joined the attack on the Fleche. A charge by Russian cuirassiers forced Murat to take shelter in a square of Württemberg infantry. Murat, with his flamboyant dress and reckless courage, had now even made a name for himself among the Russians. The Cossacks in particular saw him as a kindred spirit and were eager to capture him alive if they could. To the south, Polish troops now took Utitsa, which the Russians set ablaze before withdrawing.
Yep.
But General Bagavout's reinforcements arrived just in time to shore up the Russian flank. Around 10 AM, Eugène launched another attack on the Great Redoubt. It was briefly captured by
massive.
Moran's 1st Division, before his men were thrown out by a ferocious Russian counterattack. The Russian army's 27-year-old artillery commander, General Kutuzov, was killed leading one of these counterattacks. A heroic death, but a blow to the organization of Russian artillery for the rest of the day. Fighting continued to rage around the Fleche earthworks. Some counted as many as 6 major French assaults, involving 45,000 troops, with hundreds.
It's just astounding to even look at a painting of this, right? And I believe that this was done by the company that Epic History TV works with, but still, I mean, wow. The close quarter, just the brutalness of all this. And I know it's a little bit, dramatized and whatnot, but nonetheless.
Hundreds of cannon on both sides, pouring fire into the packed ranks.
Yeah.
More than once, French infantry fought their way into one of the Russian positions, only to be driven out again at bayonet point.
Bayonet point. 6 feet away from
Junot's Westphalian Corps was sent forward in support, helping to clear Russian skirmishers from the woods to the south. General Bagration was close to the action. Overseeing the defense of the Fleche, leading forward reinforcements and ordering counterattacks. Around 10 a.m, he was hit in the leg by shell fragments. Mortally wounded, he was carried from the field. Shaken by the loss of their iconic commander, the exhausted Russian infantry began to fall back. The French finally took the flesh. Marshal Murat then led forward Friant's division, First Corps' last reserve, supported by waves of heavy cavalry on both flanks. Russian grenadiers formed squares to ward off the French cuirassiers, while their own guard cavalry fought the French in a giant confused melee, with heavy losses on both sides. The Russians resisted doggedly, but the combined onslaught of French artillery, cavalry and infantry proved irresistible. As the Russians pulled back, Friant's infantry fought their way into the village of Semyonovskaya. The Russian center was in disarray and seemed close to breaking. Surely now was the time for Napoleon to deliver the knockout blow.
I was gonna say, how's he gonna shore up the defenses here? Wow. Yeah.
For most of the day, Napoleon remained at his headquarters near Borodino. Those around him later said that illness, as well as the exertions of the long campaign, had left him tired and irritable. As the Russian center buckled, Murat and his staff urged him to send forward his last reserve, the Imperial Guard. The Emperor refused. If there is another battle tomorrow, he asked them, where is my army? But he did make one exception. Barclay was continuing to move troops from his unengaged right wing to bolster the center. As Osterman Tolstoy's 4th Corps arrived behind the Russian center, French observers feared they were massing for an attack. So Napoleon ordered forward General Sorbier's Guard artillery. His batteries opened a devastating fire on the enemy. Yet even as they were mown down in their ranks, the Russian infantry stood their ground.
Wow.
On the Russian right wing, all remained quiet, so General Platov, commander of the Don Cossacks, proposed that he lead an attack on the lightly defended Borodino village. Permission received, Generals Platov and Uvarov led a force of 8,000 Cossacks and cavalry across the Kalacha River.
Just into this time.
They fell on French and Italian troops around Borodino with complete surprise, spreading panic and disorder. Grouchy's 3rd Cavalry Corps had to be pulled back across the river to drive off the Russians.
Yep.
Russian commanders saw this raid as a missed opportunity, but it had delayed the next French attack by 2 hours, and may have persuaded Napoleon that he was right to hold back his reserve.
Happenstance that it did further convince him to hold back his Imperial Guards here, but still, devastating counterattack here from the north. 22nd time. Can you even fit enough wound badges onto your uniform after that?
Around 3 p.m, the French launched their biggest assault yet on the Great Redoubt. Russian gunners targeted the French infantry advancing to their front, allowing French cavalry to outflank the redoubt and charge it from the rear. Saxon cavalry were first in, cutting down Russian infantry and gunners almost to the last man. It was an astonishing feat by the horsemen, against all the rules of war, and testament to the ferocity of the fighting. As Eugene's infantry consolidated their hold on the redoubt, he ordered forward all the available cavalry to exploit this success. But they were met and checked by the last Russian cavalry reserves. Eugène now implored Napoleon to commit the Imperial Guard.
But he wouldn't.
But again, the Emperor refused. "I will not destroy my guard," he told his staff. "I am 800 leagues from France, and I will not risk my last reserve."
I wonder if that was the good idea or the bad idea of what that would have done. And I have a feeling that in Napoleon's retreat video, which is going to be coming up next, I have a feeling that this Imperial Guard is going to come into a huge, huge use, and that maybe it was the right idea to not. So if he had to push them forward, right, and he would have broken them there in the center, interesting. But it's like, could they have fallen back in enough time? Would the Imperial Guard really have packed enough really firepower and a punch to be able to break through these lines here and completely destroy the Russian army? Would it have been a complete destruction of the Russian army? Because it's not like really Russia has anything left after this too, right? But I wonder if there's any sort of theories on this of what if he had have sent forward his Imperial Guard here and what the conclusion of it might have been.
By 5 p.m, both armies were in a state of utter exhaustion.
Yep.
The battlefield was strewn with dead and wounded. Some infantry battalions could muster only a third of their strength. Cavalry could advance no faster than a trot.
Hell on earth.
Gun crews were collapsing with fatigue. As dusk approached, fighting slowly died out across the battlefield. Napoleon and the French army expected the fighting to resume the next day. But by dawn, Kutuzov, having learned the full, horrifying scale of Russian losses, had ordered a withdrawal.
Yep. Okay, so there you go. There's maybe the answer.
The losses on both sides were enormous. Russian casualties are estimated at 44,000. French losses around 30,000.
Oh my God.
Including 49 generals. 12 of them killed.
Jeez.
Borodino would prove to be the bloodiest single day of the Napoleonic Wars.
Yep. By a long
The Russian
shot.
army could not fight another battle until it had received major reinforcements. And so Kutuzov decided that he must abandon Moscow. On the 15th of September, a week after his victory at Borodino, Napoleon entered the city. He would find it virtually deserted, and already the first fires starting to burn.
Yep. And I mean, what a sight too, right? So to think that Napoleon, I mean, I know that he waits through the winter and does eventually decide on this retreat, but he believes that this is going to be the end of the war, right? The most, although it's not the capital again, one of the most major cities has been captured by the French, and yet this isn't it. This isn't even close to being it. And so with Borodino over, next we'll be looking at his great retreat, which is an affair in and of itself, to say the least. So thank you very much for joining me for this one. I was like actually super captivated here. Usually I want to pause more and give more comments, but I was just like, sorry, a little bit more captivated than usual. But I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found it entertaining anyways. Go support Epic History TV, a fantastic channel. Thank you all very much. I really, really appreciate it. Thank you for your support. Take care. See you guys in the next video.